For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Unionist Patrick Craven joins me to discuss his book titled The Battle for Cosatu, An Insider's View. Thank you for your time, Patrick. You were born in England and you joined Thabo Mbeki in setting up an anti-apartheid society, and you were also part of those who organized a march after the Rivonia trialist Govan Mbeki, his father, was found guilty of high treason. Why were you interested in South African politics at that age, as well as working with unions after?
Well, South Africa was becoming a big issue all over the world. This was shortly after the Sharpeville massacre, which I think made people aware of what was going on in South Africa. And I think, in a sense, the fact that Thabo Mbeki was at the same university was coincidental. I'm sure I would have got involved to some extent anyway, but it obviously gave it an extra personal touch, to be working alongside somebody whose father could face a possible death sentence. I mean, this was clearly something that a lot of people felt strongly about. So that's why we organized that march, which I think did have an impact. I mean, it was part of an international campaign, and who knows, it may be things like that that actually led to life sentences rather than death sentences, which is obviously a very important victory.
Why was it so important for you to write this book, and who should be reading it?
Well, I hope everybody will read it, but particularly workers, trade union members, because Cosatu was very, very important in South Africa, and ought still to be, because clearly workers need the sort of organization which Cosatu was originally intended to be, and for many years indeed was, a very militant, fighting organization that took up the huge challenges which workers faced after years of being treated little better than slaves under colonialism and apartheid. And the main reason for writing this book is that I felt that Cosatu had lost that vision, was simply becoming an adjunct of government. And that's the main point I wanted to bring out, because at the time there were all sorts of other issues around the expulsion of Zwelinzima Vavi, this expulsion of NUMSA, which were not, in my view, the main issue. The main issue was that they stood against this drift towards becoming what we sometimes called a Labour desk of the governing party, which we were totally opposed to. And it's significant that most of the opposition to Vavi and to NUMSA came from people who subsequently became government ministers. And this, I think, was an indication of what was going wrong. And I think that things that have happened since have completely vindicated the stand that Vavi, NUMSA and I took, that Cosatu is beyond repair. That's why we're now going for this new federation, which we hope will do what Cosatu originally was intended to do, and preferably do even better.
How were you drawn in the labour movement fraternity? Because in London you started working with the African National Congress.
Well, I never worked closely with the African National Congress. I was more involved in British left-wing politics then. But as you'll see from the book, my wife happened to meet a group of exiles and worked very, very closely with them. And so that's what made the direct connection between what was happening. I was still obviously interested in South Africa, but I was now personally committed in a way. So it was mainly she who actually took the initiative in coming over, but I was very happy to go along with that, because clearly there was a lot to be done. And my main work, by the way, has never been in the trade unions. Like a lot of people who are appointed as spokespersons, they come from a media background. In my case, very much a sort of socialist left-wing media. And so I've continued that to this day, when I'm still, to a small extent, working in the media.
Okay. And in the book, it looks like you are blaming the South African Communist Party for Cosatu's implosion. What can you say about that?
Well, most obviously, if you look at the main individuals who were leading the charge against NUMSA and Zwelinzima Vavi, they were leading members of the Communist Party. Slovo Majola, Fakile Majola, now a government minister, was always the key figure. But I don't think there's any doubt that behind the scenes Bladen Zamanzi was playing a role. And those people in Cosatu who were leading the charge were also at the same time prominent members of the Communist Party. So clearly this wasn't a coincidence. Clearly there was some policy decision that something had to be done. At that time, of course, the SACP was very closely linked to the ANC. Today that isn't quite the same, but it hasn't fundamentally changed, because in our view the SACP is merely supporting one particular faction in the ANC rather than another. Not that they've changed their basic approach, which is, in our view, still to try to advance their interests by getting government positions and infiltrating the establishment and the government, which is exactly the opposite of what I believe in. That if we're going to have change, it must come from below, from the workers. And this is what I hope the new federation and the new party, which is also in preparation, will do, so that we have a real alternative, not just a slightly different version of the ANC.
Okay. Can you also tell us what was the main reason you decided to leave Cosatu and to join NUMSA, which is now in the preparation of the federation?
Well, in my view, NUMSA was always the main issue. And I had always assumed that Zwelinzima Vavi would resign from Cosatu at the same time as they dismissed NUMSA. But as you see in the book, for a short time he thought, well, maybe he could reverse that decision. So I thought, well, I'll go along with this. But I wasn't at all confident that that would be the case. And of course, as we know now, it didn't make any difference whatsoever. Within a matter of months, he followed NUMSA. And that was really the turning point, because there was nothing left that I could fight for in Cosatu. And don't forget, my position was the spokesperson. So I would have had to go on television, talk to Creamer Media, explaining why it was right to expel Zwelinzima Vavi, which I just felt I couldn't do because it was fundamentally wrong in my view. And joining NUMSA was, in a sense, a logical step from that, because their politics were far closer to mine. They were doing what Cosatu should have been doing, and still are. And in particular, I was already committed to the idea of a new federation. Even then, I thought there was no hope that Cosatu would be revived. And of course, in the rest of that year, 2015, we saw two Cosatu congresses, a special one, and then the normal national one, which reinforced my view because they endorsed all the decisions. I mean, the only possible hope was that there might be a move from other unions to reverse those decisions, but it didn't happen, although not without a fight, I would have to say. They had to bend the rules significantly in order to get those decisions through. But it's quite clear after that that Cosatu was now in the hands of people who ultimately are not working in the workers' interests at all, but are more interested in government positions supporting ANC and government policies, which are exactly the opposite of what a trade union ought to be fighting for. Policies in the interests of big business rather than policies in the interests of workers.
Can you also tell us the relationship between you and the president of Cosatu at this stage after you've left him?
I haven't actually met him at all. So I don't want to personalize things, but I doubt if he and I have much in common at the moment. People change, of course, but I'm not at all optimistic that he seems to be firmly committed. I mean, even this latest move by the SACP, although I think he's now reluctantly gone along with it, at first he was opposed to that, said we must still support Jacob Zuma. So I can't see much basis for me having any kind of rapprochement with him.
You've been quoted in some articles saying that the new federation will be more effective. What do you think went wrong in Cosatu?
The fundamental problem, I think, was that in most of the unions, not all of them, I must say, particularly not in NUMSA, power shifted from the bottom to the top. Unions were run very bureaucratically, and in some cases corruptly. And I'm not just making vague allegations. Several union leaders have actually appeared in court. At least one former president of the Transport Workers Union was convicted. Well, he pleaded guilty. So, and there are many others in the pipeline of clear evidence that union leaders were actually embezzling funds, workers' money, which is a terrible crime for a trade union leader. And this is why, apart from NUMSA, there have been a number of small unions who've broken away from Cosatu unions, precisely on this basis, that they no longer felt that those unions represented them. But on the other hand, there was the political issues that Cosatu had for many years, right up until at least 2012. The National Congress in that year took some very radical resolutions, but in practice the government was toning down its criticism of pro-business policies because of their relationship with the ANC leadership. And that was how the whole debate began, with what was described as anti-majoritarian positions. In other words, the argument was, well, the ANC government was democratically elected, and if we oppose the ANC government, we're going against the majority of voters, which a trade union can never simply accept.
You also speak of how the second deputy president of Cosatu, Zingwisa Losi's appointment further crippled the federation despite being fired by NUMSA at Ford. Why did you say that?
Mainly because it was clearly a breach of the rules, which are very important in trade unions, that there must be rules which ensure that things are done democratically and in an orderly process. And in her case, that clearly wasn't the case. She was rejected by the members of NUMSA who'd elected her into a position, and that meant she was not eligible to stand as a Cosatu office bearer. And so immediately she joined Pop Crew, and within a matter, I think it was of days, became a shop steward and therefore was qualified. And we simply could not accept that Pop Crew members had actually sat down and had a meeting and discussed whether she should be their shop steward or not. It was blatantly a manoeuvre, and clearly was a slap in the face, particularly for NUMSA, because that's who she used to represent. And it was more or less saying, well, never mind NUMSA, we want her there anyway. And clearly it was because she was in that faction, which was anti-NUMSA and anti-Vavi.
You also write about the CEC meeting that saw NUMSA expulsion in November 2014. But from reading it in the book, it's not clear how you felt. Was the expulsion a shock for you, or did you expect it?
I expected it, unfortunately. It had been widely predicted. And normally in Cosatu you can work out in advance the way in which most unions will vote, because it's partly for good reasons that unions have to be mandated by their members, and so they can't just suddenly change from one position to another. And the majority of the unions had already made it quite clear that they wanted NUMSA out, and indeed that's what happened.
Do you think Cosatu is representing the working class properly, or you also agree with those who are saying it's been too involved in politics lately?
It's definitely not representing them properly. It's not just that there's nothing, by the way, wrong with being involved in politics. It's which particular politics. It's the ANC leadership's policies. But apart from that, we feel that they're not. There are two examples recently, and one very recently. One is their support for Cyril Ramaphosa, which we feel is entirely wrong. Despite his trade union history, we believe his more recent history is clearly pro-business and his whole political outlook seems to be now pro-big business. And we cannot see why a trade union federation should go out of its way to nominate him. The second is the national minimum wage, where we think Cosatu has been prepared to accept a minimum wage which is way below what we consider a poverty level. Never mind a decent wage. 3,500 is not enough to live on properly, and we believe that given that it's the workers who create the wealth of this country, they should get a far better share of that. And finally, just recently, I saw a report that Cosatu has demanded the deportation of some Chinese workers who've been employed. And I think it's outrageous. We're not defending the company that brought those workers in, or even more so, the South African company that outsourced the work to that company. But to blame the workers, which is in effect what Cosatu is doing, because they're the ones who will suffer, is absolutely outrageous. Internationalism is one of the founding principles of Cosatu, and they ought to be standing up for workers, whether they're South African, Zimbabwean, Mozambican or Chinese. Why aren't they recruiting those workers instead of wanting to throw them out of the country? Which is a small thing, but it's, I think, symptomatic of the fact that it's lost its way.
You are also involved in the new federation. Can you just briefly tell us how is it going to be different from the other unions that you are seeing? How is it going to help the workers in South Africa?
Well, the main aim must be democracy. We feel that we should stop looking at leaders and look instead at workers' democracy. That's where far too many of the other opposition groupings to government have gone wrong. They've simply been formed around a particular leader. We want a mass party which won't have a commander-in-chief. It will have democracy from below, which is one of the reasons why it's taken a little time to get off the ground. Although the launch in Congress is now in March, so it's not now too far away. And obviously it won't immediately become a mass revolutionary organization. It will have to build. And we believe that it's also important that it recruits amongst the vast majority of South African workers who are not members of trade unions at all, which is often forgotten. People who talk about these overpowerful trade unions forget that 76% of workers are not in any union at all, and yet they're the ones who most need a union. Migrant workers included, all the workers whose jobs have been casualized or have gone to labor brokers, they must be the target. And what we hope won't happen is that the existing unions will be trying to build by stealing members from other unions. That's not going to solve anything. Which is why, although we have about 50 different unions, some of them are very small, and we would like to see them coming together to form bigger unions. Particularly because nowadays the workplace is changing. The days where you could say, well, a particular group of workers do a particular kind of work in a particular kind of place, they're our members, and we're not interested in the others. Nowadays you get people doing all sorts of different jobs in the same workplace. You get workers who keep changing their jobs. There'll be particularly those with labor brokers, could be working in one firm one week and then another completely different one the next week. We have to find ways of bringing them in because they need unions. A good example is the Uber taxi drivers, who are supposed to be self-employed, which is of course nonsense. They're employed just like anybody else and are struggling to survive. They need a union. In some other countries they are now organized. So that's what we hope. But also politically, we must go back to what Cosatu used to stand for, and still did right up to 2012 by and large, of putting workers' interests above all else and opposing the pro-business line which the ANC government is now taking. And go back to policies based on the Freedom Charter, which, although not specifically a socialist document, certainly has a socialist attitude towards problems, sharing the wealth, common ownership of the means of production, as well as all the democratic demands, which many of which have still not been realised. We've achieved formal democracy, but we haven't in any way abolished all the legacy from apartheid, particularly, of course, when it comes to the ownership of wealth. And you only have to look at, strangely just, I think it was in the Saturday Star, there were some pictures of some awards being given to financial institutions, and they had these pictures. And it was at least 3/4 white males. It quite clearly showed that nothing much had changed in those organisations, and that's something we still have to take up.
Can you just tell us, for interest's sake, what are you currently doing now after your resignation earlier this year?
I'm doing some writing for the Daily Maverick and for Media 24, which appears as a column in City Press, and I'm hoping to do more of that. But I'm still available. I may be well over the retirement age, but I would be very happy to work in any capacity, particularly to help the new federation and the new party, because that's where I feel I can make a contribution.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, for your time. That was Unionist Patrick Craven speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his book titled The Battle for Cosatu, An Insider's View.